Going to take a look at scatter plots, and we're going to take a look at how we interpret that scatter plot and also using what we call a line of best fit to help predict some data values. So first thing we want to do is talk about what some of these words mean. We have scatter plot, which is a graph that shows a set of ordered pairs that represent data values. Basically, you take two variables, you get a bunch of data about them, you plot them on a graph, and instead of connecting all these dots, we take a look at what the relationship is. When we talk about relationship, we're talking about the correlation. And when we talk about correlation, we're wanting to know if the correlation is positive, negative, or if it has no correlation. Correlation is the relationship between the two data values, or the variables. For instance, if it is a positive correlation, that's as one data value increases, so does the other. So for example, the more questions you get right on a test, the higher your score. As the questions that you get right goes up, so does your score. Now on the other hand, we could also have a negative correlation. A negative correlation is that as one data value increases, the other value decreases. The common misconception is thinking that if, well, positive is as one increases, so does the other, that negative would be as one decreases, so does the other. That, in fact, is actually a positive correlation as well, because they're both doing the same thing. In fact, negative is as one does one thing, the other one does the other. So, for example, as the temperature outside increases, your heating bill is going to decrease because you won't need the heat as much. Now, if it's not positive, it's not negative, this is where there is no relationship or no correlation within the data. For example, something that might be no correlation would be the amount of food you eat and the amount of time you spend playing video games. Those have no relationship to each other. Now, when we talk about relationships, we like to put out what we call a line of best fit. This is going to be a line that goes through the center of the data and best interprets what that relationship is. Now, causation is the last piece. When we talk about causation, this is when a change in one data value results in a change in the other data value. So for example, the more hours you work, the more money you're going to earn. And the less hours you work, the less money you're going to earn. Therefore, the amount of time you work causes there to be the amount of money that you make. So now the first thing we're going to talk about today is correlation. We want to know if the graph shows a positive, negative, or no correlation. And then we're going to interpret that using our data values. So our first one is correlating test score and study time. And as I can see, if I look here, I can say that, you know what? That in general, with few exceptions, that shows that as your study time increases, so does your test score. I would consider this to have a positive correlation. That means, just like I talked about interpreting, we just talked about that. The more time spent studying, the higher the test score. And one other thing we can also talk about when we talk about correlation is how strong the correlation is. And if I look here, and I'm going to go ahead and erase my line that I drew in here. When I look at this, I see that this has what we would call a moderate correlation. Now, while the points are a little bit spread, if you take out these 3 points that are kind of outliers, the majority of the data falls within this tight area. And so it is a fairly strong correlation, but we're going to say moderate because we do have these 3 points that kind of scatter away from the general population. Now, if we look at the second example, this is looking at the relationship between the number of siblings and your GPA. And as you can see, the points are scattered all over the place. This is what I would call no correlation. because there really is no relationship. And for that interpretation, we would simply say no relationship between, I'm going to abbreviate between, number of siblings and GPA. Because clearly the number of siblings you have does not indicate your GPA. Now if we look at this last one takes a look at the relationship between the time on medication and the number of illness symptoms that you have. As you can see, I can draw a pretty good line through this data. And as the time on medication increases, the number of symptoms is going down. This is what we would consider to be a negative correlation. And as I just mentioned, as the time on medication increases, the number of symptoms decreases. And if we look at the strength of the correlation, as you can see, all of these points are really tight close to that line that I drew. This would be a very strong correlation, because the purpose of taking medication is to decrease your symptoms. Now, one of the things we're going to get into now is we're going to start talking about this line that I've just drawn in the next video.